Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kassandra Sparks. I am on the board here at CLAGS, and I'm very excited to introduce our panel on mediating sex work. So all of the panelists are going to present their papers, and then we'll have time at the end for 15 minutes of Q&A. Our panelists' bios, you can find the full bios in the CLAGS program or on the CLAGS website. So I'm only going to read just the first sentence of their bios. Kay Mullen is a recent graduate from University College Dublin, Ireland, where she received her bachelor's degree in English literature, drama and social justice, and her master's degree in gender, sexuality, and culture from UCD Ireland. Sanchari has a PhD in English and Film Studies from Wilfrid Laurier University. Their dissertation focuses on representations of the subaltern in South Asian Canadian women's literature and how those representations challenge the happy narrative of Canadian multiculturalism. And Ishaana is a poet and writer in progress from Mumbai, India, currently a senior in the undergraduate program at Sarah Lawrence College, where they study transfeminist of color critique, histories, and politics across various disciplines of need.
For many here, the name Playboy may spring to mind the image of a magazine or a nightclub with waitresses in bunny costumes. For those of us who spent their teens in the mid-2000s watching television past midnight, the word Playboy conjures a very specific memory: the Girls Next Door reality TV show. A world where young women could have whatever they dreamed, lived in mansions, drove expensive cars, and partied until dawn. Through the TV screen appeared the world of celebrity, money, and freedom, while in actuality, the reality of this reality TV show is far more complex. What took place within the Playboy mansion was a reality dependent on the fulfillment of a stringent gender role, stereotypes, and rules to please a magnified patriarchal hierarchy. For some background for those who didn't grow up watching the E! Channel in 2005, the Girls Next Door reality television show was a program that aired on the E! Channel between 2005 and 2010. The show centered around the lives of Playboy magazine's editor, Hugh Hefner, and his three living girlfriends as they spent their days living in the famous Playboy mansion, promoting the Playboy brand and portraying the ultimate celebrity luxury lifestyle. During the airing of the program, the three living girlfriends each took up the mantle of a designated stereotype, into which they were assigned to play within the hierarchy of Playboy Mansion. In this way, the show occupied a unique space in American media as a hyperthropic celebrity program, docusoap, and celebrity reality show all in one. Holly Madison was known as the primary girlfriend or first girlfriend. Holly's role within the mansion is to behave as the guiding female figure, to sleep in Hefner's bed each night, to be a homemaker through event planning, and to advise other women who come to the mansion of proper behavioral protocol and etiquette when around Hefner. Madison did this while wearing a string of pearls and tight-fitting clothing that was portrayed as provocative while maintaining the most modest wardrobe of the three girlfriends. The second girlfriend was Bridget Marquardt. The role of the second girlfriend is slightly different. As an example, she resided in her own room down the hall from Hefner, but it was still expected to be available at any time. Bridget was described the stereotype of the ditzy blonde, a role she played carefully during her time on the show as she worked to balance her persona and her graduate studies behind the scenes. Kendra Wilkinson was the third girlfriend. Again, she had her own room and was the youngest of the three. Her role was defined as the sex-crazed, sporty, irreverent but loyal girlfriend. The third girlfriend, in some ways, is a contrast to the former two, as Wilkinson embraced the role laid out to her more enthusiastically than the other women. These three women resided within the Playboy mansion, not for the romantic relationship they possessed with Hugh Hefner, who could rival their grandfather in age, but for the success, money, opportunity, and celebrity that came with being one of Hefner's girlfriends. To get an understanding of what occurred between 2005 and 2010, I'm going to talk about precarity over consumption, work, and the use of control over women as a gender-affirming act for Hefner. I'm also hopefully going to express the link between the performance of feminine gender roles and access to celebrity and success that was afforded to the girlfriends. It is argued that raunch culture is based in the idea that for women, it was no longer needed to worry about objectification or misogyny. Instead, it was time for them to join the frat party of pop culture where men had been enjoying themselves all along. This post-feminist perspective is one that permeated the culture of the 2000s and allowed for the life at Playboy Mansion to be viewed as the ideal. At first glance, it does seem like a dream, a glamorous estate filled with luxury celebrity parties and an iconic figurehead, Hugh Hefner, at the centre. To the outside world, Hefner's girlfriends appear to be living in paradise, surrounded by wealth and fame with no strings attached. But unfortunately, many of these women faced extremely precarious living situations emotionally, socially, and materially. The conditions of their lives were often shaped by control, a lack of autonomy, and an unstable future tethered to the gender standards of one man. The three girlfriends were expected to conform to a rigid set of rules. There was a strict 9 p.m. curfew, mandatory group outings, and expectations for how they dressed, behaved, and interacted with others. While the three women lived in the mansion worth millions, they often had limited financial independence. Hefner gave them a weekly allowance of about $1,000. This money was primarily meant for clothing, beauty upkeep, and personal expenses of maintaining the performance of femininity expected of them to remain at the mansion. This money was not meant for savings or building a secure financial future. It was not meant to provide independence, but instead to further place the three women under the control of Hefner. Despite being three of the most recognizable women in the Playboy brand, the three women lacked any substantial control over their own lives. In particular, their working lives and lack of long-term job security. Despite living at the mansion, the girlfriends had no ownership or legal right to the property. If they fell out of favor with Hefner or chose to leave, they were effectively homeless overnight. With many of Hefner's past girlfriends before the filming of The Girls Next Door falling out of favor due to aging past what Hefner deemed to be acceptable ages for his girlfriends, even time was a factor in the precarity of the girlfriends' lives. There was no contracts guaranteeing housing support, pensions, or future income. Their status at the mansion was entirely conditional, reliant on their continued relationship with Hefner and their submission to the gender roles and rules set out by Hefner and their willingness to play the part of the ideal Playboy girlfriend. After leaving the mansion, Holly, Bridget, and Kendra found themselves still struggling to become fully detached from the Playboy world. The Playboy Association, while it offered temporary fame, didn't always translate into substantial careers or opportunities. After leaving the Playboy spotlight, a major loss for the women was the reduced capacity to attract and mobilize attention for capital gain, a commodity that was essential to the financial security of these women. Some, such as Kendra Wilkinson, were able to leverage their visibility into media and branding ventures, with others faced stigma and challenges reintegrating into the life outside Playboy bubble. Even today, Holly Madison and Bridget Marquardt are still somewhat financially dependent on the celebrity Playboy afforded them, as they produce a recap podcast of the show Girls Next Door for profit. Overconsumption functions as its own force within the show and influence within the lives of the girls next door. It's one that runs through the show's entire airing period. Levy's arguments are brought to life in the show, with camera shots focusing on oversized mansions filled with naked young women and with the many montages of shopping trips being the catalyst for episodes. Consumerism seems to live side by side with the integration of raunch culture into the lives of those who lived in Playboy's world. The lives of the three living girlfriends, as they are captured, revolved around personal consumption, with many episodes following the living girlfriends as they would plan parties, attend events, and go on shopping sprees. The show, while focusing on the lives of the three women, is focused on the large amounts of money being spent by them. The personal overconsumption that takes place can be argued to be directly in response to the need of the women in the household to perform acceptable and thus raunch femininity in an overt way to ensure security of their place within the household. This adherence to the raunch femininity standard within the mansion, being intrinsically linked to the overt overconsumption, is particularly on display in shots of Kendra Wilkinson's third girlfriend's bedroom. Earlier, I mentioned that Kendra had been assigned the stereotype of the sporty tomboy girlfriend, and as such, she claimed to abhor anything quote-unquote girly. However, we see that everything she has purchased to decorate her room is pink, glittery, and adorned with feathers or fluff. The room itself is overcrowded with clothing, shoes, makeup, CDs, and Playboy products, which populate every surface in the room and overspill onto the floor. The vast scale of the expensive items that are strewn around the space haphazardly is deemed an appropriate performance of gender under the mansion standard, as it is portrayed as the image of abundance that Hugh Hefner wanted to convince the world he possessed. Through the continuation of this act of gender performance, Kendra could ensure the continuation of her weekly payments from Hefner, securing her own success. The act of partaking in work is one that also illuminates the link between feminine performance and capital success within the mansion. For the three girlfriends, this took the form both of participating in approved work and the erasure of non-approved work. Participation in work as a living girlfriend of Hugh Hefner involved a weekly schedule of events, which included hosting movie nights at the mansion, accompanying Hefner to events, including 2 nights of clubbing a week, and maintaining the image and reputation of the Playboy Mansion as a playground for the rich and famous, while being meticulously manicured and maintained to Hefner's standards of beauty. Work as a celebrity influence, because of the popularity of the Girls Next Door show, was also curtailed to be of maximum benefit to Playboy Enterprises. With the work of the secondary girlfriend, Bridget Marquardt, being a primary example, Bridget was assigned the role of the ditzy blonde, whose life ambition is to be featured as a playmate in Playboy magazine. This storyline was followed throughout multiple seasons of the show and was framed as a cornerstone of Bridget's life. This focus on her only ambition being to pose nude is yet another performance of submission to the power of her male counterpart, who controls the magazine as its editor-in-chief. Bridget actually placed her career life cycle into the hands of the man who controls the rest of her life. She continues this pattern of work by hosting a radio show on Playboy's radio station and recruiting waitresses for the Playboy nightclubs. Throughout the run of the show, we appear to see Bridget embrace and be enveloped by her performance of feminine devotion and submissiveness to Hefner, and by proxy the Playboy brand, through the erasure of Bridget's other career achievements and aspirations. While filming the show, Bridget actively pursued a master's degree in communications. This is hardly given any airtime past season 1, while her aspirations to be in Playboy magazine, which would fit neatly into the image of the ditzy blonde girlfriend, are enhanced on screen. While the image of Bridget portrayed in the show devalues her efforts towards her education, it was necessary to place her as being the picture-perfect Playboy-approved girlfriend, securing her income from both Hefner's allowance and from her work with the Playboy brand. To rebel against this image while living at the mansion would mean she would lose access to the capital she required to continue her education, adding to her already precarious living situation. While the 3 women who starred in The Girls Next Door were the focus of the show, there was also the occasional presence of Hugh Hefner on screen. Hefner provided the show with an example of what was framed as ideal masculinity within the mansion. Hefner cultivated a public persona that was not only highly visible, but also deeply gendered. Hefner's lifestyle, marked by overconsumption, economic dominance, and social control over a household of women, was crafted as a performative display of masculinity. His actions and choices during the filming of The Girls Next Door reflected a broader cultural narrative in which power, consumption, and control functioned as affirmations of manhood, tailored to the 2000s American ideal of male success. Overconsumption served as one of Hefner's most overt tools for signaling his masculine identity. His famous Playboy mansion, lavish parties, silk pajamas, and continuous presence of luxury cars, fine dining, and an entourage of young women were all carefully orchestrated elements of an image that relied heavily on consumerism. In post-war America, male identity was increasingly tied to one's ability to consume rather than just produce, and Hefner presented himself as the ultimate consumer of goods, experiences, and of women. Through this, Hefner crafted a reputation that reinforced the association of wealth and access to celebrity with male power. Hefner's professional identity as editor-in-chief of Playboy was another cornerstone of his masculine image. He was not just a businessman, he was branded as a tastemaker, a cultural gatekeeper, and a brand in and of himself. Maintaining job security at the top of such an empire was a constant reassertion of masculine authority in a competitive and highly publicized domain, one that highlighted in the show as being the reason Hefner was so rarely on camera, as the reality TV world of the girlfriends was deemed as beneath his masculine importance. This would later be seen as an error, as the success of the show challenged Hefner's reputation for media intellect and expertise. Within the mansion, Hefner positioned himself as the benefactor, protector, and arbiter of value towards the women living there. The social hierarchy of the mansion reinforced traditional gender roles, with Hefner at the apex of a feminine environment structured to orbit his preferences and desires. Even in the later years of his life, which are covered by the Girls Next Door TV show, when his power was less rooted in youth or vitality, the structure of the Playboy household ensured that his masculinity remained unchallenged. In this way, power over 3 women's social, economic, and sexual lives was framed not as exploitation, but as the reward for achieving peak manhood. Beneath the facade of freedom, and celebrity being portrayed through the combination of both post-feminism and raunch culture ideals like rigidly enforced gender roles, systemic control, and conditional access to capital, celebrity, and success that was always contingent on compliance with Hugh Hefner's vision of ideal femininity. Through the performance of gender in accordance with the post-feminist raunch culture, overconsumption, and gender-informed labour, the reality TV programme showed the three women as they navigated a life where their agency was limited, their work often unpaid or unacknowledged, and their futures uncertain. The Girls Next Door exposed the illusion of empowerment often promised by post-feminist and raunch culture narratives, showing instead how these frameworks can reinforce traditional power dynamics under the guise of choice and freedom, far from being the fantasy of liberation, which the show presents itself as on the surface. Life at the Playboy Mansion demanded continuous gender performance, emotional and economic dependence, and an acceptance of deeply entrenched hierarchies, making a stark and needed reminder of the true price of celebrity in modern times. Thank you.
Okay. I don't know how to do that. Yeah. I'm supposed to go down.
So you're trying to figure out.
Yeah, I think that's okay. Yeah, that's it. Oh, okay. How do I make it full screen?
I think it's at the bottom, the little.
Yeah.
We can't get the cursor over.
Oh,
Oh, if you use the mouse and go up to slideshow,
there.
This was.
Then
just one cursor.
Oh, it's over here.
Okay.
Oh.
So I have.
Might have been about.
Okay. But it's not. Maybe I can do enter. No.
Oh, one of the Fs does a present, right? Like is it F4 or something? One of the
Here, let me
Fs does
let's
it.
see.
Yeah. Think.
Yeah, here we go. That's that. Oh, I see. Maybe like, no.
I think one of the like
It just has to go
Wait,
slide.
how did you start your presentation?
got up to slideshow.
Up there,
Yeah, except it's not going, you see?
How did you get up
Yeah.
there?
if you hit escape one more time, it might bring the cursor there.
Wait, let me Google which of the Fs.
This is, it's not, no, it's not. Ours not working.
Enter, so like
Shift F5.
Shift,
I googled it, says Shift F5.
Shift F or function?
F, I think.
Oh, Shift F5.
No.
Okay. No, it's not doing it.
Oh, it might just be F5.
Oh.
No. Okay.
I am so
So this is,
By Alt.
This function not work?
function F5.
Alt F5.
No.
Oh, there.
Oh,
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, I am presenting on Shimmering and Sex Work, which is interrogating unhappy phantasmagoria through representations of trans femme sex workers and crossing. This is obviously done very last minute, so that's why I don't have the title on the screen. All right, so I'm going to introduce the concept of shimmering phantasmagoria first before I go into my analysis. Shimmering phantasmagoria, according to Eliza Steinbach, is an optical device and conceptual vehicle that stresses the spectral quality of trans bodies. This spectral quality highlights a kind of haunting, where filmic representations of the trans body exist through their lingering phantasmagoric aesthetic. This lingering phantasmagoric aesthetic seeks to capture the temporal drive of the phantasmagoria to access a new sensorium. Rejecting the binary notion of the before-after transition, Steinbach's new sensorium, where sensorium refers to affect, personifies the visual representation of the trans body as disorienting juxtapositions. I posit that these disorienting juxtapositions of affects create a mobilizing space of unhappiness, which is a space of agency, where the trans representations enter a future-oriented reparative mode. Steinbock states that film enters the reparative mode via the temporal drag of the Phantasmagoria, and by doing so enables a resequencing of trans histories. This mode gives pause to reflect that if the past could have been less traumatic than it actually was, maybe the future will be too. Since the inheritance of trans phantasmagoric imagery with the specter of the horrific seems to be passed down mainly to trans women, I interrogate the shimmering phantasmagoric trans female body and the disorienting juxtapositions of their affects in the Turkish film Crossing through the trans femme sex worker characters Tekla and Evrim, situating this analysis in the context of class. Just want to point out to the poster, neither Tekla nor Evrim are on the poster. The characters are actually cishet characters, but just something to keep in mind. So Steinbock's shimmering phantasmagoria in the case of trans female bodies on screen uses the lusus spinosist not yet of affect, which aligns with the not yet affect of Sarah Ahmed's promise of happiness. This promise of affect and its generative relay into affect theory must acknowledge in the not yet of never quite knowing that there are no ultimate or final guarantees, political, ethical, aesthetic, pedagogic, and otherwise, that capacities to affect and to be affected by will yield and actualize next or new that is somehow better than now. So I'll talk about time in a bit because we did talk about temporal drag, but this will make a little more sense as I go forward. Steinbock situates their trans shimmer in the space of never quite knowing, where shimmers are difficult to grasp as knowable entities. They argue that trans people and trans cultural producers have experimented to create new images that reintroduce shimmering into our line of vision as scholars and viewers. Steinbock's shimmering is their concept of change in its emergent flickering form. So trans shimmering is literally, it literally refers to flickers of lights on screen and what those flickers hide and reveal in relation to the trans body on screen. These flickers point to the disjunction between what one thinks they see on a trans body and how that trans body speaks its subjective identification. A disjunction that is a kind of dissonance between the senses of seeing the trans body and the affect of that trans body onto the seeing. Steinbock states that in both cases, the resulting bodily effects can register in a range of affects, where affect itself is the emotional quality that transfers from surface to surface. I posit that this dissonance is a friction between the affect of the viewer, the emotional qualities the viewer's body already carries and how that affects what they see on screen, and the affect of the body, what the viewer feels in their body after the seeing. So it is in this friction of seeing and feeling that a shimmer is created. So Crossing, which is a 2024 film by Levin Etienne, who's the director, is about a Georgian woman, Leah, that's Leah, and her search for her niece, a trans woman named Tekla, who has crossed the border into Turkey and may now be in Istanbul. Leah seeks her niece to fulfill her sister, Tekla's mother's dying wish to always protect the niece. In this search, Leah is accompanied by a former student, Zaza's brother, Archie, that's Archie, who begs Leah to let him come with her on this trip to the big city. In Istanbul, they take the help of a trans woman, Evrim, a former sex worker, who's also current lawyer and volunteer for an LGBTQ plus community center in Istanbul. So one of the most telling introductions to Tekla as a transgender woman is early in the film. Zaza, who's Archie's brother, says, "Forgive me for what I'm about to tell you." Leah, "What are you sorry about?" Zaza, "Some strange people used to live in those cottages. Prostitutes." I'm not saying that your niece was. Here, the affect of strangeness has both to do with Tekla being a sex worker and with being trans. So in this instance, Tekla is doubly strange or doubly othered as being a sex worker as well as being a trans person, trans woman specifically. So Tekla is a paradox. Leah's former student Zaza's wife asks her, "What's the name of your niece?" Leah answers, "She calls herself Tekla." In this exchange, in the pause between herself and Tekla, Tekla's transness is hinted at which is then made explicit in the following exchange. Archie says, she's talking about one of those trans girls. Archie's older brother Zaza says, you better watch your mouth, boy. Tekla exists in the dialectic between the familiar and the unfamiliar. While her unfamiliarity as a trans woman makes her a taboo, there is familiarity within her relationship to Leah, a respectable ex-teacher to Archie's older brother. There is a friction between these two positions of the familiar and unfamiliar, of taboo and respectability, creating an affect of dissonance for the spectator through their disorienting juxtapositions. In this friction of the familiar and unfamiliar, Tekla disrupts audience expectations, her absence making her a specter, a literal ghost because we never actually get to see her, who exists in memories and imagination. Her absence holds the possibility of reparation, of Leah's family and the loss that drove her family apart. Tekla's spectral quality with its reparative possibilities becomes apparent in her visual introduction through Leah's perspective. Again, apologies for the janky photos. I'm obviously a little technologically challenged, which became apparent this morning because I left this till last moment. Anyway, Tekla appears to Leah through her disembodied hand that reaches out from the shadows, caresses Leah's hand that lies in partial light, and then holds it. A second shot follows where the same hand reaches out of the darkness to caress Leah's cheek that is in partial light. In both shots, Tekla's body is out of frame, pointing to the spectral quality of her trans body. The hands appear in Leah's dream preceding her trip from Georgia to Turkey in search of a niece. Tekla's hand lingers as a phantasmagoric aesthetic, marking Leah's journey across the border and through the film. Tekla exists in her absence as the not yet of Ahmed's promise of happiness, of never quite knowing that there are no ultimate guarantees of a better than now. The space of a paradoxical absence is the only space that Tekla can occupy within the narrative space. Even in the final sequence between Tekla and Leah, director Levin Akin subverts audience expectations of a happy ending. The final sequence is a chance meeting between Leah and Tekla. The camera focuses on Leah's feet as she walks away from the hostel, her black pants and flats in focus, while she wheels her red and white checked trolley. Her path crosses with the feet of her niece in black laced boots and black tights. While Leah passes her without a glance, again highlighting Tekla's spectrality, it is Tekla who stops and calls after Leah more than once. Leah turns and walks towards Tekla, where Tekla's face resembles her mother's, Leah's sister's younger face. They hug, cry, move apart and hug again. Leah caresses Tekla's face, mirroring Tekla's disembodied hands caressing her face earlier in the film, and says, you look just like your mother. Is it really you? The scene cuts to another scene in Tekla's kitchen in a house she shares with her boyfriend. She runs a hair salon that her boyfriend owns, no longer engaging in sex work. This idyllic scene is broken without warning when Archie appears in the kitchen and says to Leah, go on, what would you tell her? Through the sudden substitution, Akin disrupts the ephemerality of these moments as wishful thinking on Leah's part, relegating Tekla to her spectral chance shimmer. It is a moment of dissonance between the audience's expectation of a happy affect, of a happy ending, and the unhappy affect of the shock of a narrative without a clear conclusion. In this dissonant dialectic, Tekla continues to exist as a shimmering phantasmagoria and refuses to conclude. In Evrim's case, the first time the audience sees her is from above, where she's literally on a higher tier of the ferry, symbolically in a higher class position than Tekla's. From this angle, we can't tell Evrim is trans. There's an easy confidence in her body, she's smoking, juxtaposed against the moving water. Her transness is made explicit later in juxtaposition between the way she towers over the crowd of people while she makes her way confidently through it, and the way people in the crowd stare at her in sudden moments, some even turning to catch a glimpse. The stark reality of Evrim, however, as a trans woman and as a former sex worker, comes into focus in the scene from the hospital where she's in the process of getting her female identification card, or at least applying for it. So in this scene, this is the first scene that comes where she's waiting to be called by the doctor. So she's sitting here, these cats would just bite her, and then this other cat just climbed onto her lap and almost as if comforting her even. In a sense, as if the cat humanizes her as opposed to the humans that do not a little later in the scene. So in the scene right after, she faces the doctor, and the doctor's asking her all these questions and giving her forms to like go fill up by the different departments in the hospital. And he's asking very, I would say, inappropriate, irrelevant questions like, so where are you working now? Do they pay you? So you're not doing any sex work? And everyone says no. Every time he hands her a form, he fails to look at her directly. He just does not look at her at all. But at the end of it, everyone is so happy. She gets up with a little skip and she compliments the doctor. She says something like, I really like your haircut. I mean, look at this hair. Right? Like, you look really handsome or cute, something like she says. And she's just about to go out the door. And I think in that moment, she regains her power, her agency. And in this scene, the doctor finally looks up at her. So in this context, in this juxtaposition of the two scenes, the sex work aspect is literally built into Evrim's body, even though she's no longer a sex worker. So it kind of hints at the precarity of trans women's lives, especially in Istanbul or Turkey, where they do not have any option but mainly to engage in sex work. And because the taboo, the stigma of sex work itself, they're also outcast as a result of it. So it's like a catch-22. In a scene between Leah and Archie, Leah says, so like my niece, she only found sex work and that's the only work she chose. And then Archie's like, I hardly think it's about choice. So that was a very telling dialogue as well about the precarity of trans women's lives in Istanbul. In this case, Evrim gains her visibility. She basically, her little maneuver basically says, you can pretend you don't see me, but I see you, and you will see me see you. There's a lot of agency in that moment. Another scene. Oh, sorry. Was that the last scene? I guess, okay. Fine, I'll just keep talking. All right. The other scene is with Omar in the car. So Omar is this young guy who calls after us. She's walking home. It's like, I can give you a ride. And she's like, I'm not a sex worker. And she keeps walking. And Omar's like, that's fine. You know, I don't care. I just want to give you a ride. And then she's like, I'm trans. And then Omar's like, did I ask you? Like, I just want to give you a ride. So she gets in his car and there's obviously chemistry between them. And then they show them hooking up in a corner somewhere in the car. It's kind of like dark. But the focus, I don't have that scene here, unfortunately, but the focus is on Evrim's pleasure. And by centering her pleasure in that moment, she kind of goes into that reparative mode. The trans shimmer really happens. Even though there's no flickering lights, even though we see her face even in the half darkness, she takes agency in her pleasure, and as a result, she rewrites her past as an ex-sex worker, but she also rewrites her future, which is what we will see a little later in my paper on the film as well. So I thought that was a very stark example of the reparative mode that rewrites time, the temporal drag that Steinbock talks about. And another scene, this is a scene where Tekla and Evrim finally get intertwined, you can say, in the narrative. So Evrim gets a lead from her community center that Tekla was probably a sex worker living in this brothel at the other end of the city. Okay. I'm almost the conclusion. Okay, other end of the city, and they actually made the check with Leah and Archie. And there they meet the mother who runs the brothel, and she says, many Georgian girls have come through here, all of them stuck up noses in the air. You know how it is with these girls and drugs. They go down that road, there's no return. If you ask me, she probably left Turkey. So, I mean, in closing, what I want to say is that Tekla is narratively dead. Like, the character has killed Tekla off, okay? But Evrim gets to live because she's no longer a sex worker. So, because okay, what's the ending? Can I just quickly go?
Yes.
Okay, so the scene where she actually rewrites the future is the scene with Evrim and Omar, where unlike most of our former lovers who just come and sleep with her and then visit her in the morning and never take her out in public, he asks her, are you hungry? She says, always. He says, want to get breakfast? She says, why not? And then he says, let's go then. It's a really like a happy ending of trans joy. And even the trans joy is coded in trans shimmering. That is not the case for Tekla. Tekla basically is written completely out of the narrative by the director, and I think that is because the director has a little bit of a class bias. And so basically what the film says is that sure, you can have a life of agency as a trans woman on screen, as long as sex work is not part of that, as long as you're not a sex worker. And if you get out of sex work, like every you get to live and have your joyous, happy ending. Thank you.
Right.
I'm just going to hear from moral support because I haven't yet figured it out.
Okay, thank you. Because
I do see the cursor here. Isn't that crazy? I don't know what got there.
it's president.
I do see it.
You could just shut them too because
Here. And then it's FN F5. Oh, amazing.
okay, hold up. This is my presentation. I'm gonna just set up my timer. Sorry. And okay. I have a bunch of resources here to support Jaya Cruz and Gia Valentina, two trans women in prison right now. Gia was violently transferred into a men's prison in Jersey almost 3 years ago, and Jaya is held at Bedford Hills, where we're losing women rapidly. And Fight to Live is holding a workshop and teach-in on the 22nd in Chinatown.
Ishaana, can you move up the microphone?
Oh, so sorry. Wait, okay. There we go. Okay. I'm gonna start with a little snippet of a poem by Asata Shakur. After you know that the dead are still walking, after you realize that silence is talking, that outside and inside are just an illusion, what is left? The prison is structured by sex, and sex is structured by the prison. The ordained social order of sex, reproduced by and reproducing what we might call cisness, is carceral. The relations incubated within the prison act as synecdoche counterparts to those outside, reproducing their violence as sexed, sexual, and sexuating. Cisness, like criminality, is the incision that divides bodies and labor into good and bad along racial and class lines, much like prisons and ghettoization serve to cleanse white, bourgeois, which is to say cis space, of the undesirable bodies of those racialized and sexually transgressive subjects deemed criminal and thus disposable. The prison, in turn, keeps the population in line, enforcing and reinforcing the structure of cisness by doing its dirty work. Key to the functioning of this matrix is the mystification of the white bourgeoisie's considerable room to play within and around these systems, as shown by Emma Heaney and Sophie Lewis in On the Cisness of the Bourgeoisie. What stabilizes these formations is the conditionality of their enforcement under the guise of purported naturalness, empiricism, and universalism. On the other hand, sexual transgressions of the non-bourgeois majority, whether social and somatic transition practices and or having sex that isn't private, cis, hetero-free, and in service of the reproduction of the classed white family, are constantly and conditionally reproduced as criminal and policed by the carceral apparatus, serving to keep the population in line, to reconsolidate the structure of cisness and remove the people it produces as aberrant. Criminality and cisness coming into being in and through each other and the biologizing, carceral, racial colonial logics of enslavement and settlement also mirror one another in making deputizing, prison guards and cops out of people on the outside, which in turn serves to justify the conditions inside. The so-called transpanic defense comes to mind, exonerating or reducing the sentence of those brought to trial for attacking or murdering trans women. Hugh Hewitt attests to the constitutive histories and enforcements of racialization, cisness, and criminality in his paper, Gender is Carceral, to reflect on how abolitionist praxis is and can be responsive to the reality that all of these histories have accumulated such that today, in this settler colony we call the United States, gender is carceral. Following the work of George Jackson and Michel Foucault, he illustrates how, quote, non-state actors frequently perform a carceral function in upholding gender norms. From parents who discipline the genderqueer practices of their children, to catcallers who harass passersby for so-called cross-dressing, everyday people routinely appoint themselves as gender pigs, gender police. Harming and reporting sex workers at their sites of work, photographing and surveilling strangers, releasing people's information because they seem to be doing the work of sex all wrong, this is all pig work. Where this paper departs from Hewitt's thesis is in its scope. He writes, to be gender nonconforming under gendered racial capitalism is to be constantly subjected to policing by the state and everyday citizens alike. Doubtless, this is true. But I argue that these are the conditions that produce the sex body in the first place, all in the name of protecting and preserving the white bourgeois settler nuclear family, its much touted women and children, but also its precious men, from the feminized racial filth of low sex, the destruction wrought by the revelation of universal penetrability. If cisness, as Heaney shows, establishes a mutually reinforcing equation among penetrability, submission, and degradation, then cisness is not what someone is or has, but rather a carceral structure that both bifurcates and hierarchizes, animated by its offer of a homology between cisness and bourgeois whiteness, and a persistent denial of the ontological reality that all bodies are penetrable. These dynamics are laid bare within the walls of the prison, which in turn recreates their conditions of possibility. The mythology and experience of incarceration is steeped in sexual violence, so much so that consensual sex between prisoners is reported by COs as rape, while the gratuitous rape of prisoners by and under the supervision and/or command of COs is perpetually shrugged off and encouraged. The first thing that those sentenced undergo post-sentencing is a laborious sorting by their perceived sex via strip and cavity searches, and this significantly determines their experience thereon. Inmates deemed sexually aberrant, particularly those who are trans and transfeminized, spend most of their time within the super void of solitary confinement or maximum security units, where their abuse accelerates with impunity, simply hidden away a prison within the prison. The model infinitely replicates and is neither novel nor exceptional to trans people. Assata Shakur's 1973 imprisonment in 2 separate men's prisons with over 20 months spent in solitary confinement is but one example laid bare of carcerality and cisness as co-constitutive disciplinary systems, first principles in slavery and its ungendering and engendering sexual violence that excludes blackness from the order of human sexuation and sexual life as its form of other. Trans women in prison are V-coded, a practice so common within American men's prisons that it defines the experience of most trans women incarcerated therein. They are deliberately placed alongside, quote, aggressive cisgender male inmates as a form of social control. In this way, the people most often arrested, harmed, and humiliated for their association with or participation in the informal, racialized, classed, transfeminized economy of sex work are forced to consistently perform forced sexual labor for cellmates and COs under conditions of extreme harm and humiliation alongside their mandated prison labor. Crucial to this matrix, then, is the matter of work. Neither cisness nor criminality can exist or persist without it. Cisness is reproduced through the coerced sexual sexuating labor of those measured against its racial capitalist structure, and criminality is another conscription into labor, simultaneously demarcating and patrolling the boundary between labor done white and labor done wrong. Both are incentives into labor and threat promises to ensure its continuation. Central to this paradigm is that of value, biologized and triangulated with one's proximity to bourgeois Euro-American cis heteronormative manhood. The more one's work or sex is seen as capable of generating white bourgeois reproductive productive value under the schema, the less likely it is to be punished. Concurrently, quote, the category feminine/female is the social expression of the valuelessness of reproductive labor, Heaney asserts, associated with wageless work and devalued both when unwaged and when they are waged as feminized service sector jobs. Histories of transfemininity, Heaney reminds us, in addition to being constructed around this valueless historical structure of reproductive labor, emerged from association with a particular form of waged reproductive labor, sex work. Always already racialized and classed, the persistent criminalization of which sets it apart from other feminized work, and by extension sets apart the forms of social life it produces from the category of cis womanhood. The racial sexual order of reproducing and being reproduced by cisness and criminality operates with transmisogynoir at and as its core. Histories of transfemininity are histories of racialization, are histories of coloniality, are histories of prostitution, are histories of criminality, are histories of incarceration. This understanding of sexuation and the ideology of sexual difference itself as entailed within a carceral, whorephobic, racial patriarchal regime, encoding and enforcing cisness and heterosexuality through kinship, property, and labor relations in the afterlives of slavery, necessitates a conceptual reckoning with sex and gender, a recognition of both as malleable and intertwined constructions of cisness, reinforcing and stabilizing one another, as well as the racial sexual order of human ontology. This move denaturalizes gender sex and challenges the liberal fantasy of sex as nature and gender as culture, articulating an abolitionist politic grounded in transmateriality and the analytic doublest terms racial sexuation, recognizing that the taking for granted of gender sex as ontology necessarily ontologizes anti-blackness through a naturalization of heterosexuality and misogyny, and this is its purpose. To understand transsexuation as work, one might turn to the work of Josie Giles, who demands, in the vein of the international wages for housework movement, wages for transition. She writes, marked by capitalism as those with too much gender and too little, we work a second shift, a third, a fourth, to acquire the resources necessary to produce our genders, to produce genders survivable under capitalism, at least for another year. And further, as those whom capitalism has produced through its cis-heteropatriarchal division of sex classes and gendered labor, whom capitalism has spat out as the uncosted externality of gender, we labor to produce the very gender on which capitalism depends. You live in our work. Put into conversation with Douglas's observations and C. Riley Snorton's in Black on Both Sides, that the fungibility of blackness engenders the conditions of possibility for imagining sex as mutable and for the reproduction of the sexual order at all. The crucial fact of the system's foundations in transmisogynoir can be uncovered from under layers of disavowal. The bottom of the ladder is thus marked by the presence of gender and sex workers, inextricable from their stigmatization, these being the prostitute, embodiment of sex, and the prisoner, embodiment of criminality. These positions are both always already racialized and classed, mediated through their proximity to transmisogynoir, and often overlap as the dregs, the lumpen, the damned. The fear of sex between incarcerated women reproducing, quote, generations after generations of criminals is often the purported justification for their forced separation by genital configuration, locating criminality within and as a product of criminal sex, a gene that can be inherited and therefore eugenically eradicated. This logic is not accidentally reminiscent of the long-standing campaign situating the reproduction of race and therefore enslavement, criminality, and destitution within poor and enslaved Black people's sex organs and practices. Neither cisness as a carceral system nor the carceral complex of sexual violence could survive without biocentrism as a eugenic racial codex and criminological fixation delineating bodies and labor, a disavowed belief in so-called intelligent design that is certainly racial theological in origin. These observations align with those of Sylvia Wynter, who discusses the overrepresentation of man as human, theocentric with man 1, ratio, and biocentric with man 2, where the subsumed and discarded human represents the racialized other that man defines himself against. Wynter observes a systemic pattern that this category of the damnée that is internal to and interned within the prison system of the United States as the analog form of a global archipelago, attesting to the prison as the inside that lays bare and microcosms the workings of the outside, is constituted by the third and fourth world peoples of the so-called underdeveloped areas of the world, most totally of all by the peoples of the continent of Africa. Wynter writes, as her subtitle announces, towards the human after man, its overrepresentation. But what if her human itself, just like what cisness outlines as sex, is also entailed inextricably within this imperial order? As Saidiya Hartman asks, what about the ways that the recognition of humanity and individuality acted to tether, bind, and oppress? Philosopher Axel Carrera takes this forward, identifying Wynter's goal as towards a reinvention of the human, distinct from man's biological and economic overdetermination, praising her text but questioning its dispositional intuition, according to which there exists necessarily a hierarchical normative opposition between, on the one hand, an imperious conception of the human, and on the other, the human itself. She observes that the category human as opposed to man, much like sex as opposed to gender, seems to have evaded scrutiny and transcended historicization, even though it subtends the very humanism that Wynter critiques. Carrera asks whether it might be that the human as a metaphysical value beyond the order of meaning always already initiates the circulation of violent exchanges between difference and differential modes of being. She condemns Western humanism but warns against its singularization, and with this provocation addresses the terrifying mundanity, neither specificity nor privilege, of Western humanism's violence over all other forms and modes of violence, located by Douglas as always already oriented by the sexual. Douglas shares Carrera's provocation, asking the same regarding sex and how the hyper-visible and repeated sexual violation of the slave is structurally positioned by a forced relation with human violence, which in turn is displaced onto the slave as its possession. This is where we might return to the prison. If the prison is the continuation of chattel slavery, the relation which subtends the prison as an incubator is not a corruption of Wynter's human, but crucially enabled by it. The human necessitates a non-human other, in nature, in transfemininity, in blackness. The prison, the third, fourth world, the street corner, and the grave are the places designated for these others under the human sexual order. Sexual violence defines these others along an axis of unrapeability, articulated and simultaneously mystified by the socially ordained and maintained orders of cisness and criminality, persistently policing their existence, sociality, movements, and practices. Jackie Wong and the aforementioned Winter write about cases through the 80s and 90s where police officers would close all reports of rape and violence made by sex workers, gang members, and addicts by placing them in a file stamped NHI, no human involved. This is testament to the human order's endemic antagonism with the figuring of the non-human, unrapeability outlined in proximity to a perceived imposed ontological viability triangulated through transmisogynoir. Rapeability is also simultaneously unrapeability, in that the rape of someone who is not considered human does not register as rape. The violence of sex is carceral, and carceral violence is sexual. Both of them are all too human, and to study and marked by labor. To study this reveals not only the transmisogynoirist coloniality underpinning and stabilizing these structures in what Hartman identifies as the afterlife of racial slavery on occupied land, context this essay situates itself within, but also offers an avenue into understanding and unsettling the mutual construction and instability of these systems altogether. If each needs the other to reproduce and sustain itself, then how necessary could any one be? Theorists such as Hortense Spillers, Douglas, and Heaney have outlined what they believe to be the anchor of this axis of unrapeability in Black female flesh ungendered, in femininity, in the human order of racial sexuation. In Spillers, in Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, proposes that the captive body embodies sheer physical powerlessness that slides into a more general powerlessness, resonating through various centers of human and social meaning. Heaney's analysis, essentially similar down to the operative language, positions vulnerability along the rapist's perception of their victim as actually, properly, or potentially socially positioned as powerless, a positioning then reinforced in its relation to the feminine through the use of the tactic of sexual assault with its historically produced relation to the feminine. I have like 5 more lines. Douglas, however, attends to the order of the human and argues against both, that the metaphysical presuppositions of sexual violence do not constitute all beings as equivalently rapeable or sutured and arranged by the perceived submissive nature of femininity, and maintaining gender as an ironclad alibi to explain why the slave is saturated by sexual violence does more to mystify the structure than to reveal its truths. Instead, she contends in the vein of Carrera that the human is not freedom from sexual violability, it is its making. This essay argues a sort of synthesis, that the racial sexual class order of the human founds and is founded in transmisogynoir, defined against Black and Indigenous lifeways and labors practiced by transfeminized people in the fourth world. The small prison simply lays bare the brutal mechanisms and violence of the big prison. The system of spatio-temporal domination realized through labor and articulated through the racial capitalist sexual constructions of cisness and criminality.
I would like to invite the panelists back up, if it's okay. We put Q&A. Thank you all. That was so incredible, and I'm so excited to hear more about your work and for everyone in the audience to ask some questions. So does anyone have a question for our incredible panelists?
Yeah, I have a question to Doug.
Can I ask
Oh,
you to
yeah.
speak into the
Definitely.
Amazing.
Hello. I wanted to ask you about the role of the camera and filming as a precursor to camgoaling, and also just about the inherent eroticism of self-surveillance, with also the mirror as a historical precursor to it, like vanity and yeah.
With what is it?
So with the mirror as because it's often like camgoaling is not only the person being on the other end of the goal or not being observing the person observing the goal, but not only that, it's also the goal observing herself in the webcam or like whatever,
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think that's a great idea. I think you should write that paper. And no, I'm seriously, because there's so much symbolism in what I was trying to kind of weave together for this paper, which is more like a kind of creative essay in some ways. And I didn't go as deep as I would have liked to with like the actual mechanism of wrong camming, like in the sex work landscape, and like the technicality of like the different forms of online sex work and like how those are mediated and negotiated. I think there's a lot there, as you say, like with the particular nuances of eroticism, like when you're sharing, when you're like streaming your image in that way and like also observing yourself. So yeah, I mean maybe another it's definitely a way to go deeper with this theme. So yeah. Yes.
Yeah, this question is kind of for all the panelists. But I mean, was thinking about it in your work in all sorts of different ways. But thinking about essentially female roles in policing gender, and how it essentially is a pitting of one against the other, and it is a kind of a if we think of sex as labor in the context of Playboy or camgirling or in the prison, there is this kind of impetus to undermine labor's solidarity within feminized and even trans feminized as well. Like there is kind of no natural solidarity, and I think you all talk a lot about sort of the violence that goes into that. And thinking about sort of the other side of that, what do you think are kind of the forces that encourage in sort of a, in a carrot and a stick kind of idea, what do you think are the sort of the benefits that are granted towards, don't want to say normative female sexuality, but in order to encourage women to police themselves and police each other.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think specifically in what I was studying with the Playboy girlfriends, it was definitely a dynamic that was absolutely present. Especially with the ranking of the girlfriends, the first, second, third girlfriend thing wasn't just who slept in the bed, who didn't. It was a preferential thing. And age was definitely a factor, and it was disrupted to have the girlfriends be pit against each other for male validation of male attention. But I think the choice specifically those three women made was to value each other over any monetary gain. And I think having that critical lens against capitalism, even though they were functioning within it, was essential for them to kind of prioritize other women over the male force.
I think just on the subject of how we police each other and how we're incentivized to police each other, I think there's so much to be said. Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay. I think there's so much to be said about like sort of like I said, how like cisness deputizes all of us to police each other and to scrutinize each other. And like it's not just, amongst like between cis and trans women, it's amongst ourselves and each other, deeply embedded. And there's so much incentive to do it, right? Like feminization, at least the way that I see it, is crucially formed through this policing. Otherwise, how would we articulate what feminization or femininity or any of that is? But yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say that just because I wouldn't really pit cis sex workers against trans sex workers, especially trans femme and female sex workers against each other. I'm thinking, well, because I'm obviously doing representations on film, I'm thinking of the film Tangerine, and I think the one who gets the really rough end of the butt by the end of the film, apart from obviously one of the trans sex workers, I never watched it, but it's actually the cis white woman who finally goes back to where she was doing sex work, and they don't let her in because they've replaced her space that she's standing outside barefoot. So I was just like, it all depends on context as well. And I think another thing is Mika Cardenas speaks about how violence is intimately bound up in trans women's bodies, to the point where more visibility is actually detrimental to trans women. It can literally lead them to their deaths. So keeping that in mind, I guess what was my point? My point was when it comes to the context of sex work specifically, I think it just creates its own context of precarity.
I have one last thing, if that's all right. Yeah, just like feminization and femininity like doesn't exist in isolation or in a vacuum, right? It's always being measured against something, and that's where the policing comes in. And like, yeah, the sex body doesn't exist without what it is sexed against.
All right, we are at time. But thank you to our amazing panelists for this conversation.